Welcome to today's screencast on the Torah's take on kosher fish, part of our unit on the laws of kashrut. I am guessing that from an early age you learned what it takes for a fish to be considered kosher. That is, of course, a fish that has both fins and scales. Now, you see, all fish have fins for a very simple reason. That's because all fish have tails. The tail is a fin. It's called the caudal fin. It's located at the rear of a fish. Fish also have a dorsal fin, which is located along its top, and a pelvic fin located along its belly. Some fish, but not all, have scales. Those are the bony-like structures along the outer skin layer, and some fish even have scales that lie beneath the skin layer, which is called subcutaneous. S-U-B, sub, is the prefix in Latin that refers to something in place of or beneath, like submarine, which goes beneath the water, or substitute, which is instead of another, like a substitute teacher. So some fish have scales that are both above the layer of skin, some fish have no scales at all, and some fish have scales that even lie beneath the skin layer. And we're going to be focusing on the question of kosher scales in just a moment. But here's what the Torah actually has to say about kosher fish. This is in Parshat Shmini in Sefer Vayikra. The Torah is quite clear. Eit asher tochlu mikol asher b'mayim. Here is what you can eat from the fish that are in the water. Kol asher lo snapir v'kaskeset. And these are the two key words, snapir and kaskeset. So let's get to know these two words. Snapir refers to the fins. As I said before, all fish have fins, so that's not really an interesting question for us. A more interesting question, and the really, in this case, sole determining factor in what's going to make a fish kosher, is its second sign, kaskeset, the scales of a fish. And whether a fish has kosher scales is a question that has occupied lots of Torah commentators, and fortunately for us, one of those Torah commentators, the Ramban, who lived in the 12th century, 1100s, and early part of the 1200s, the Ramban helps us understand what kaskeset actually means. According to Ramban, kaskeset refers not just to any old scale, but a scale that can be removed without tearing the outer layer of skin. Now remember what we said earlier. Some fish have scales above the outer layer of skin, and some fish have scales beneath the layer of skin. Now, if you have fish whose scales lie beneath the outer layer of skin, obviously if you take those scales out, it's going to rip the outer layer of skin as they are removed. And so those scales, even though they would count as scales from a biological standpoint, from a scientific standpoint, those cannot be counted as kosher scales because they would actually rip the outer layer of skin. The kind of scales that we want, the kind of scales that fit the criteria of kaskeset, those are scales that can be removed without tearing the outer layer of skin. Now, this becomes an important question when you're buying fish without kosher certification. Let's say at Whole Foods, where some of the fish are sold in an open market like this, without pre-packaging. Now, it may be a good idea to always buy fish that come prepackaged with kosher certification. That way you know for sure that the fish you're buying meets the standards of snapir and kaskeset. But there are times when it's okay, and not only okay, but even completely permissible, to buy fish without prepackaged kosher certification. And that's something that we're going to look at a little more carefully in class, the specific conditions and circumstances under which a person can actually buy fish without a prepackaged kosher certification. Let's take a moment, though, and review some of the things that we've learned. Kosher fish have two qualifications: snapir, which is fins. That's not such a big deal because all fish have those. But the more important factor, the most important determinant in kosher fish, kaskeset, scales that, according to Ramban, can be removed without tearing the outer layer of skin. When we come back to class, some questions that we need to discuss in more detail are the following. When it comes to scales, are there other issues we need to consider aside from the fact that they don't rip the outer layer of skin when they are removed? What about the size of the scales, or the color, or the shape? What if a fish had scales at some point in its life, but dropped those scales when it was taken out of the water? We'll learn about one kind of fish, a very popular kind of fish, that actually loses its scales when it's taken out of the water. Is that a problem? Under what circumstances can you actually buy a fish, like at Whole Foods, that does not have kosher certification? When is that allowed, and what are the conditions that make that possible? And finally, the question of skin. Why is this the most important factor when choosing a fish that does not have prepackaged kosher certification? What do you have to look for? And are there any exceptions to the rule of a fish having its skin on in order to buy it? These are some questions that we'll consider in class. Thanks for watching the screencast, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you when we get back together.